She was on her knees in the dirt when he first saw her. Not praying, not crying, not begging. She was pulling herself back to her feet. Both hands pressed flat against the dry Montana earth arms, shaking jaw set hard as iron, and she rose. Slow, deliberate, like the ground itself had tried to keep her down, and she had decided one more time that it would not win. William Carter stood at his fence and watched her, and felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in 5 years. He ignored it. If this story moves you, I want you to subscribe to this channel right now and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me. Now let's begin. The notice William Carter had nailed to his fence post was not elegant. He was not an elegant man. It read, "Farm worker wanted, honest pay, hard work required, no excuses accepted." He had written it himself with a carpenter's pencil on a piece of rough board, and he had nailed it up on a Monday morning without much hope, and with even less patience. The 2 men who had quit the week before had left him with a broken fence line on the north pasture, a sick horse named Thunder who wouldn't eat, and a kitchen that hadn't produced a hot meal in 11 days. He was not a man who complained about hardship. He had survived too much to waste breath on complaint. But he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hours he worked. He was 34 years old and he felt 60. 5 years earlier, his wife Eleanor and his younger brother James had been killed when their wagon overturned crossing Miller Creek during a flash flood. William had not been with them. He had stayed back to repair a section of fence, and that decision, that ordinary insignificant decision, had divided his life into 2 halves that no longer resembled each other. The man he was before that day was someone he barely remembered. The man he became after, it was someone he didn't particularly like, but had grown accustomed to. He stopped letting people close. Not because he was cruel. He wasn't cruel. The people of Red Hollow would have told you that William Carter was fair, that he paid his workers honestly, that he never cheated a man in a business deal. They respected him in the careful, distant way that people respect a fence post. It was solid. It served a purpose, and you did not lean on it expecting warmth. What they would also have told you quietly when he wasn't listening was that he was impossible to work for. Not because he was harsh, because he was exacting, because he noticed everything, because he had no tolerance for carelessness and even less for excuses. The ranch hands who came through the Carter property in the years after Eleanor's death lasted anywhere from 3 days to 3 months. Some left because the work was genuinely brutal. Maintaining a 2,000-acre cattle operation with a reduced crew was not a task for soft men. But most left because of William himself. Because he expected from others the same standard he held himself to, and that standard was ruthless. He would rather work alone than work with someone who did the job badly. So, mostly he worked alone. And the ranch, which had once been one of the most productive operations in the county, had grown quieter and emptier with every passing season. Not ruined, not broken, but reduced. Worn thin at the edges, like a good coat that had been through too many winters without proper care. The notice on the fence post was his last concession to practicality. He needed help. He hated needing anything, but the north pasture fence was a safety issue for the herd. Thunder's condition was worsening, and William had not slept more than 4 hours in 2 weeks. He needed help. He posted the notice and waited. 2 men came in the first 2 days. The first one smelled of whiskey before noon, and William sent him away before he'd finished his first sentence. The second seemed capable enough, but wanted to negotiate the pay, before he'd done a single hour of work, which told William everything he needed to know about the man's priorities. He sent him away too. On the 3rd day, nobody came at all. On the morning of the 4th day, William was in the barn, with Thunder watching the horse stand motionless in his stall with his head low and his breathing labored when he heard the gate latch click. He came out of the barn into the morning light and stopped. There was a woman at his gate. She had gotten it open herself. The latch was stiff, and most people needed 2 hands and some frustration. But she'd managed it, and now she was walking toward him across the yard. She was maybe 5'4", slight but not fragile, with dark hair pulled back from her face in a braid that had come loose on one side. Her dress was clean, but worn faded at the elbows and hem. She carried a small cloth bag over one shoulder, the kind of bag that didn't have much in it. And she had no shoes. Her feet were wrapped in cloth strips, torn from something layered and tied, and the wrapping on her left foot had come loose at the heel, dragging a little in the dirt. The wrappings were dark with stain. Not all of it was mud. She was walking steadily, not limping, not favoring one foot over the other. She was walking with the focused, deliberate pace of someone who had decided that the pain was not relevant to the business at hand. William stared. He was not a man who stared. He prided himself on composure. But he stared. She stopped about 6 feet from him and looked at him directly. Not shyly, not apologetically. She had dark eyes brown. Maybe it was hard to say in the morning light, and they were clear and level, and not asking him for anything yet. "Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice was steady, a little lower than he'd expected. "I'm here about the position." He looked at her feet. He looked at her bag. He looked back at her face. "You walked here," he said. "Yes, sir." "From where?" "Billings." Billings was 22 miles away. William said nothing for a moment. He was doing the calculation. 22 miles in wrapped cloth feet. He looked at the wrappings again. He had spent enough time around injured animals to know what dried blood looked like. "That's a long walk," he said carefully. "It is," she agreed. "My name is Clara Whitfield. I'm 28 years old. I can cook, keep accounts, repair fence line, handle horses, treat common livestock ailments, and I work harder than most men you'll find willing to take this position." She paused. "I'm not asking you to save me, Mr. Carter. I'm asking you to hire me." He opened his mouth. He wasn't entirely sure what he was going to say. She spoke first. "Before you say anything, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you can't have a woman doing ranch work. You're thinking the other men won't respect it, and the town will talk, and it's more trouble than it's worth." She held his gaze without blinking. "I'm asking you to think about your fence line instead. And your horse." William's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you know about my horse?" "I heard him from the gate," she said. "That breathing pattern wet slow with the long pause between, that's a horse that's been off feed for at least a week. Probably longer. Could be a respiratory infection, could be something he got into, could be the beginning of colic that's moved into his lungs. I've seen it before. I know what to look for." The silence between them stretched out. A crow called from somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek. "You'd better come inside," William said finally. "Your feet need looking at." She hesitated. Just for a second, a flicker of something that might have been surprise or relief or both moving across her face and then gone. "That's not necessary." "I didn't ask your opinion on what's necessary," he said. Not unkindly, just flatly. "Come inside." She came. He sat her down at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd eaten alone for 5 years and got the basin and the clean cloth and the liniment he kept for the horses, which worked just as well on human skin. She didn't make a sound while he unwrapped her feet and cleaned the cuts on her left heel and the raw skin on her right arch where the cloth had rubbed through. She looked at the kitchen while he worked, at the cold stove, at the empty counter, at the single cup sitting on the shelf. "You live alone," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do." "How long?" 5 years. She didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. People were always sorry. The sorry never helped anything. "The fence line you mentioned in your notice," she said. "North pasture." "That's right." "How long has it been down?" 8 days. She nodded, processing this. "And Thunder, that's the horse's name." He looked up at her. "You know his name. I asked the liveryman in town when I was passing through. I asked about your ranch. I wanted to know what I was walking into." William sat back on his heels and looked at her. She was looking back at him without any self-consciousness, without any performance of modesty or submission. She had done her research. She had walked 22 miles. She had shown up. "Why?" he asked. "Why what?" Why this ranch? There are other ranchers. There's work in town. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not pain exactly. Something older than pain. Something that had been sitting with pain long enough to become familiar with it. I needed a place, she said, where people judged my work, not my past. He rewrapped her left heel with clean cloth and stood up. The room near the barn is small, he said. There's a cot and a chest and a window that sticks in damp weather. The pay is fair, and it'll be on time every week no matter what. The work starts at first light and doesn't stop until the work is done. I don't make exceptions, and I don't accept excuses. He looked at her. This is not charity, Miss Whitfield. If you can't keep up, I'll tell you and you'll go. Understood, she said. And if you can keep up, I'll keep up, she said quietly. Mr. Carter, I promise you, I'll keep up. He believed her. He didn't know why he believed her. He had learned in the years since Eleanor died not to trust quickly, not to extend belief until it had been earned through observable evidence. But he believed her. He showed her the room. She put her small bag on the cot and looked around the space without comment. Then she looked at him. Can I see Thunder now? He took her to the barn. She went to Thunder's stall, slowly letting the horse hear her footsteps, announcing herself with sound the way you did with a sick animal that might be startled easily. She stood at the stall door for a long moment, just watching him. Thunder's head was low. His eyes were dull. His coat was rough. Then she unlatched the stall door and went in. William started to say something, a warning. Maybe because Thunder had been unpredictable this week, had nearly kicked one of the departing ranch hands when he came too close, but she was already moving with a kind of quiet authority that stopped the words in his throat. She moved to the horse's left side and put her hand flat against his neck just behind his ear and stood still. Thunder's ear swiveled toward her. He snorted once low and wet. She leaned in close to his nostril and listened. Then she ran her hand slowly down his neck, his shoulder along his barrel pressing gently at intervals. She crouched and looked at his legs. She lifted one forefoot and examined the frog of his hoof. She stood and pressed her ear against his flank, listening to his gut sounds with a focused attention that reminded William of the doctor in town when he was doing something serious. After 5 minutes, she came back out of the stall and latched it behind her. He ate something, she said. Probably got into some moldy hay. It's moved into his gut, not colic yet, but close. His breathing is wet because of the inflammation in his chest. She met William's eyes. You have any apple cider vinegar? In the kitchen. Slippery elm bark. I don't know what that is. What? Then I'll need to go into town tomorrow and get some. Tonight, small amounts of warm bran mash, no dry grain. Keep him walking for 20 minutes every 2 hours if you can manage it. And I need to check his temperature. William stared at her. Where did you learn all that? My father's farm, she said simply. Nebraska. We couldn't afford a vet. You learned, or the animal died. He handed her the thermometer from the tackroom shelf without another word. She was right. She knew exactly what she was doing. And somehow on that first afternoon with Thunder standing quietly in his stall, while Clara moved around him with calm, practiced hands, William Carter felt something he had not felt inside his own barn in years. He felt like someone was helping him. He wasn't sure he knew what to do with that. He found out at dinner. He had expected he didn't know what he'd expected exactly. That she would be uncertain in the kitchen maybe. That she would produce something adequate. He had lowered his expectations so far in the past 5 years of eating his own cooking that adequate had come to seem like luxury. She made biscuits from the flour and lard that had been sitting in his pantry untouched for 3 weeks. She made gravy from the salt pork and the drippings in the pan he hadn't cleaned properly. She found dried beans that he had forgotten he owned and soaked them and cooked them with onion and pepper until they were soft and rich and smelled like something a person actually wanted to eat. She set 2 plates. He sat down across from her and looked at the food and then looked at her and didn't say anything. She picked up her fork. It's not fancy, she said, but it's hot. It's the best thing I've eaten in 5 years, he said without thinking, and then felt obscurely embarrassed by his own honesty. She didn't make a thing of it. She just nodded and ate. After supper, she washed the dishes without being asked and went out to check on Thunder one more time. William stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her cross the yard in the last of the daylight, her wrapped feet quiet on the dirt, her back straight. She had been here 6 hours. The kitchen smelled like food. Thunder was calmer than he'd been in a week. The silence in the house was different, not emptier, but different. Changed in some way he couldn't quite name. He went to bed that night and slept for 7 hours straight. In the morning, she was already in the barn when he got there, and she had already checked Thunder and given him his first bran mash, and she had a list written in a small, precise hand of the things she needed from town, and the order in which she thought the repairs on the north fence should be tackled and why. She handed him the list without ceremony. He read it. She was right about all of it. "You know how to ride?" he asked. "Yes." He saddled one of the other horses and handed her the reins. She swung up into the saddle with the easy confidence of someone who had been on horseback. Most of their life adjusted her seat and looked down at him. "I'll be back before noon," she said. He watched her ride out through the gate and down the road toward Red Hollow, and felt again that strange movement in his chest. The one he had decided 5 years ago was not worth paying attention to. He went back to work, but he found himself listening for the sound of hoofbeats on the road an hour earlier than he needed to. She came back before noon as she had promised with the slippery elm bark and the other things she needed, and a small paper of hard candy that she set on the kitchen shelf without explanation. He didn't ask about it. He saw her put it there, and he didn't ask. And later that evening, when he was passing through the kitchen, he took one piece, which tasted like peppermint, and he stood in his own kitchen, eating peppermint candy, and felt something that took him a while to identify. He felt for the first time in a very long time like he was not entirely alone in his own house. It frightened him considerably. He told himself it was just the practical reality of having a competent worker on the property. That was all it was. The strangeness of having another person's rhythm in the house, another person's presence in the yard, another person's hands at work on the things that needed doing, that was just adjustment. It would pass. But Thunder ate that evening. Really ate for the first time in 10 days, pulling at his hay with something approaching appetite. And Clara came out of the barn with a small private smile that she didn't even seem aware of, and she looked up and found William standing there watching her. And instead of the smile disappearing, she just held it quietly, like it belonged to her, and she didn't have to explain it. "He's going to be all right," she said. "I can see that," William said. They stood in the yard in the cooling evening air, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment. And William Carter, who had spent 5 years building walls around himself with the same stubborn precision he applied to everything else, felt one of those walls develop a crack so small he couldn't have found it with a surveyor's tool. He turned and walked back to the house. He didn't want to think about what that crack might mean. But he thought about it anyway. By the end of the first week, the north fence was repaired. Not partially repaired, not patched well enough to hold until someone got around to doing it properly. Repaired the right way with new posts, set deep, and wire stretched tight, and every weak section replaced rather than reinforced. William had expected it to take 10 days with the two of them working together. Clara finished her half in 4. He found out because he came around the far end of the north pasture on Thursday morning and discovered her already packing up the tools, the last section of wire set and tamped and solid as anything he'd built himself. She looked up when she heard him coming and didn't say anything about the fact that she was done. She just picked up the tool bag and waited to see what came next. He walked the line. Every post, every section. He crouched down at the corners and tested the tension with his hands and checked the depth of the posts with the practiced eye of someone who had been building fence since he was 9 years old. He stood up. "You set these posts yourself," he said. "Yes, sir." "The whole line?" "Yes, sir." He looked at the fence again. Then he looked at her. "That's good work, Miss Whitfield." She didn't beam at him. She didn't make a performance of being pleased. She just nodded once the way a person nodded when something true had been acknowledged and picked up her other hand and started back toward the barn. He watched her go. He had hired people before who could build a fence. He had never hired anyone who built one like they meant it. What happened the following Tuesday was the moment things changed. Not between William and Clara. That was a slower change moving underneath the surface of the daily work like a current under ice. What changed on Tuesday was the town's awareness of her. It happened at the feed store. Clara had ridden in to pick up a supply order that William had phoned ahead for, and she was loading the bags into the wagon when Margaret Holloway walked past with her sister-in-law, and Margaret stopped. Margaret Holloway was the kind of woman who made stopping in the street feel like a pronouncement. She was the wife of Thomas Holloway, who owned the lumberyard and 3 other businesses in Red Hollow, and 1,000 acres outside it. And she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had never once wondered whether she was welcome in a room. She was 51 years old and had opinions about everything, and voiced them without invitation, which the town mostly accepted because her husband was the sort of man that towns accepted things from. She stopped and looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her. "You're the woman working out at the Carter place," Margaret said. Not a question, a categorization. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said, and turned back to the wagon and lifted the next feed bag. "What exactly is it that you do out there?" Clara set the bag down and turned to face her properly. "Ranch work, ma'am, same as the notice said." Margaret's eyes moved down to Clara's feet. She had boots, now work boots that William had taken from a peg in the barn, where a previous hand had left them, and they were 2 sizes too large and stuffed with cloth at the toes. But they were boots, and then back up to her face, and the calculation happening behind Margaret's eyes was not particularly subtle. "Ranch work," Margaret repeated. "And does Mr. Carter find that arrangement satisfactory?" "You'd have to ask Mr. Carter, ma'am." "I'm asking you." Clara held the woman's gaze without flinching. "The fence is repaired, the horse is recovering, and supper is on the table every night at 6. I expect he finds it satisfactory enough." Margaret's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "You're living on the property." "I have a room near the barn." "Yes." "Alone, with a widowed man." The sister-in-law made a soft sound, not quite a gasp, but angled toward one. Clara picked up the next feed bag. Her voice was completely even. "Good day, Mrs. Holloway." She finished loading the wagon and drove back to the ranch without hurrying, without looking back, without giving Margaret Holloway the satisfaction of witnessing a single moment of distress. But her hands on the reins were tight, and she held them tight the whole way back. And when she pulled into the yard and William came out to help unload, he looked at her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. They both noticed it at the same moment. A small silence. "Margaret Holloway," Clara said. "At the feed store." William's expression went still in a particular way. "What did she say?" "Nothing I haven't heard before." Clara climbed down from the wagon. "Help me with these bags." He helped her with the bags. But he didn't let it go, and she knew he wouldn't, because she had already learned that William Carter was the kind of man who pulled on a loose thread until he understood what it was connected to. That evening, after supper, he told her. He told her about Thomas Holloway and his interest in the Carter land. He told her about the 3 offers he'd refused in the past 2 years, each one higher than the last. Each refusal followed by some new inconvenience. A water dispute filed with the county. A rumor started in town about the quality of Carter cattle. A sudden increase in the price of feed from the one supplier who didn't work directly for Holloway's network. He told her about it the way a man told a thing he had been carrying alone for a long time, careful, precise, watching her face as he spoke. Clara listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "He wants the water access." William looked at her. "Your land sits between the Holloway North pasture and Miller Creek," she said. "Without your property, he has no direct route to the water that doesn't cross 2 other claims. That's not ambition, Mr. Carter. That's a calculated problem he needs to solve." She paused. "How are your deed documents filed?" He blinked. "What?" "Your deed, your original land grant. Is it properly filed with the county? Are the boundary surveys up to date?" He was quiet for a moment. "They should be. I filed them when I bought the property. My father's before that. Should be, she said. And aren't always the same thing. She met his eyes. I know something about documents and land records. I spent 2 years in Billings doing clerical work for a land agency before the man who ran it decided he didn't want a woman handling the accounts anymore. Her voice was matter of fact. I saw things in those records. The way a dishonest claim gets built. The way it starts small with a question about a boundary or a filing date and grows from there. William stared at her for a long moment. You think Holloway is going to challenge my deed? He said. I think, Clara said carefully, that a man who is used to getting what he wants and has not gotten it in 2 years of asking is probably thinking about other ways to get it. She pushed back from the table. I think you should pull your deed documents and let me look at them. He pulled the documents the next morning. She spent 3 hours with them at the kitchen table, reading with the concentration of someone diffusing something delicate, occasionally making small marks on a piece of paper beside her, occasionally going back to a previous page and reading it again. William worked nearby, finding reasons to be in the kitchen, though he would not have admitted to finding reasons, and watched her without appearing to watch her, and noticed the way her brow drew together when she was uncertain, and smoothed out when she understood something. Finally, she looked up. Your deed is clean, she said. Your boundary surveys are accurate and filed correctly. There's no gap in your chain of title going back to 1867. She paused. But there's a water rights document that references a secondary irrigation agreement between your father and a previous Holloway family member that I don't see a resolution for. It might be nothing. It might be the thread someone pulls. He leaned forward. An irrigation agreement. From 1871. Your father allowed a Henry Holloway that would be Thomas Holloway's father seasonal access to a section of Miller Creek in exchange for shared use of the Holloway hay baler. The agreement was handwritten, not formally recorded, and the termination of it isn't documented. She set down the paper. If Thomas Holloway has a copy of that agreement, and if he can argue it was never properly terminated, he could claim continued water access rights that would complicate your control of the creek boundary. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. You got all that from those papers, William said. I've read a lot of documents, Clara said simply. He stood up and went to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment. When he turned around, his expression had changed, not softer exactly, but less armored than usual. Less defended. What do we do about it? He said. And she noticed without remarking on it that he had said we. We find out if Holloway has that document, she said. And if he does, we establish clearly and formally that the agreement terminated when your father died, and the arrangement was never renewed. We do it in writing filed with the county before he has a chance to file anything of his own. She held his gaze. I can draft the formal termination notice. I know the language. But you'd need to get it to a lawyer in Billings to file it properly. I know a lawyer in Billings, he said. Good, she said, and turned back to the documents. He stood watching her for another moment, this woman who had walked 22 miles on bleeding feet to ask for work, who could build a fence and treat a sick horse and read a land deed and identify a legal exposure he hadn't known he had, and felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. He went back to work. He did not say what he was thinking. He was not sure he had words for it yet. The letter from the lawyer in Billings came back in 10 days with the filing confirmation, and Clara read it and set it on the table without ceremony and said, Good, that closes the exposure. And then she went out to the barn, because it was time to feed the horses. Thunder by this point was fully recovered. He had been better for almost 2 weeks, eating steadily, moving without distress, his coat beginning to shine back to health. But what had happened during his recovery was something William had not expected, and had watched with a feeling he couldn't entirely categorize. Thunder had chosen Clara. Not obviously. Not dramatically. The way a horse chose a person was quiet and gradual and unmistakable only in retrospect. But William had noticed it first when Thunder started moving toward Clara's side of the stall, when she came in angling his big head toward her shoulder in a way he had never done with William. He noticed it again when Clara was working in the yard, and Thunder, loose in the paddock, tracked her with his eyes, the way horses tracked the people they trusted. Horses did not give that kind of trust easily. William knew that. He'd had Thunder for 6 years, and the horse trusted him in the practical, functional way a working animal trusted the person responsible for its care. But this was different. This was Thunder putting his nose in Clara's hair, while she was trying to check his girth strap and her saying, "Stop it, you vain creature," and the horse sighing like a man who'd been told no by someone he respected. William had laughed, out loud. Alone in the barn watching them, he had laughed. It startled him so much he stopped immediately and stood very still, as though he might be able to pretend it hadn't happened. But it had happened. And something about the sound of it, the realness of it, the involuntary surprise of it, stayed with him for the rest of the day. He had not laughed in 5 years. He had not known that was something he missed until it happened. That evening he sat on the porch after supper. It was warm enough now in the evenings to sit outside the last of the summer holding on, and Clara came out and sat on the step below him without asking. Not beside him, just near him. Close enough to talk if there was something to say. Far enough to make it clear she wasn't presuming anything. They sat in silence for a long time. "You had family?" he asked finally. "In Nebraska. A father," she said. "He died 3 years ago. No brothers, no sisters." She paused. "No one else? I'm sorry." "He was a good man," she said. "He taught me everything I know about the land and the animals. He used to say," she stopped. "Then, he used to say that the land doesn't care about your gender, or your pride, or your history. It only cares whether you show up." William thought about that. He was right. "He was usually right," Clara said. "I didn't always appreciate it at the time." Another silence. The comfortable kind. The kind that didn't need filling. "What happened?" William said. "After he died. Before you came here." She was quiet for a moment. He had learned her silences, the ones that meant she was deciding whether to answer versus the ones that meant she was deciding how. This was the second kind. 2 years of clerical work at the land agency in Billings, she said, which I told you about. Before that, a year cooking at a boarding house in Cheyenne. Before that, she paused again. I was married, briefly, to a man who turned out to be a different person than the one I thought I was marrying. William said nothing. He waited. He wasn't cruel, Clara said. He wasn't a bad man in the obvious ways. He thought that when I stopped being useful in the ways he wanted me to be useful, I should adapt myself to new usefulness, like a tool you change the purpose of. Her voice was even, no performance of pain in it, just the flat, clear reporting of a fact. When I told him I was leaving, he told me I'd never find a place that would take me seriously, that I was too stubborn, too opinionated, too much of everything a woman shouldn't be. A brief pause. He wasn't entirely wrong about what I am. He was just wrong about whether that was a problem. William looked at her profile. In the fading light, her face was composed and still. It's not a problem, he said. She turned her head and looked at him. On this ranch, he said. What you are. It's not a problem. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away again, and he could see in the precise stillness of her face that she was working to contain something. Thank you, she said, quietly, like it cost her something. He looked away too. They sat until the light was entirely gone, and then she went inside to her room near the barn, and he sat alone on the porch for a while longer and thought about the things she had said, and about the things he had said, and about the crack in the wall he'd built that had started the morning she walked through his gate and had been growing very slowly every day since. He did not sleep as well that night. He was not sure what he was supposed to do about that. What happened 10 days later was not something either of them had planned for. It was a Sunday, which meant William had ridden into Red Hollow for supplies, which he did twice a month, and Clara had stayed back to finish the repair on the barn roof section that had been leaking. He expected to be gone 4 hours. He was back in 2. He came back early because Eli Marsh, who ran the general store and was one of the few men in town William considered a genuine friend, had taken him aside behind the counter and told him quietly, and with the discomfort of a man delivering news, he did not enjoy delivering what was being said around town. What was being said was that Clara Whitfield was a woman of loose character who had come to the Carter Ranch with the intention of manipulating a grieving widower into providing for her, and that William Carter, who was a decent man but had been alone too long, was being taken advantage of. What was also being said, and this part Eli delivered with particular reluctance, was that the story had started with Margaret Holloway, and that Margaret Holloway had been spreading it with an efficiency and conviction that suggested it was not merely her own opinion, but a strategy. William rode back to the ranch in a controlled fury that he had by the time he arrived gotten almost entirely under control. Almost. Clara was on the barn roof when he came through the gate, straddled across the peak with a hammer in her hand and a row of replacement shingles laid out beside her, working with careful precision on a section that would take most of the day. She heard him come in and looked down. She read his face in about 3 seconds. "Tell me," she said. He told her, all of it. Standing in the yard looking up at her on the roof, he told her what Eli had said, and what Margaret Holloway had been saying, and what he thought was behind it. She listened. She didn't come down. She sat on the roof peak with the hammer in her hand and listened to all of it, and her expression didn't change. When he finished, she said, "Is Eli Marsh a reliable source?" "He's never lied to me in 15 years. "Then it's true." She looked at the shingle in her hand. "And you think Holloway is behind the story deliberately?" "Margaret doesn't do anything deliberately that Thomas hasn't decided is useful to him," William said. "He's been trying to wear me down for 2 years. He couldn't do it with money. He couldn't do it with legal pressure. Now he's trying to do it by making the ranch untenable for you." He paused. "If you leave, I'm short-handed again. If I'm short-handed, the operation suffers. If the operation suffers long enough, you become more susceptible to a buyout offer," Clara finished. She looked at him. "What do you want to do about it?" It was such a typically Clara question. Not what did he think about it, not how did he feel, not wasn't it terrible, what did he want to do, as though the conversation were merely preparation for the action. "I want to make sure you know," he said, "that nothing that woman is saying changes anything on this ranch." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Nothing?" she said. "Nothing," he said firmly. "You work here. You do your job better than anyone I've hired in 10 years. What the town chooses to believe about why is not my concern, and it's not your problem." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face that was not quite relief and not quite surprise, but somewhere between the two. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She turned back to the shingle she was fitting and drove a nail with 3 clean strokes. He went back to the house, but he did not go to Eli Marsh's store again the following week without making very clear to every man who'd asked that Clara Whitfield worked for him, that she was skilled and honest and exactly the kind of person the Carter Ranch was fortunate to have, and that he would appreciate it if people found better things to discuss. He said it calmly. He said it without anger. But he said it in the voice that most of Red Hollow had learned over 15 years not to push against. The story didn't stop. Margaret Holloway's opinion was not a thing that William Carter's tone could entirely silence. But it fractured. It became one story among competing stories, and the competing stories included men who had seen Clara's work on the fence line and couldn't find fault with it, and Eli Marsh saying quietly to anyone who asked that he had met the woman himself and found her entirely sensible, and a rancher named Cole Patterson from 3 miles east who had come to William about a sick heifer and stayed to talk and watched Clara handle the animal with a competence that made him take his hat off and say, "Ma'am, where in the world did you learn that?" To which Clara had said Nebraska, and gone back to what she was doing. Patterson had told that story 3 times in town the following week. William heard about it and said nothing, and felt something that he refused on principle to examine too closely. 3 weeks after the conversation in the yard, he came into the barn late on a Thursday afternoon to find Clara sitting on a hay bale with Thunder's head resting on her shoulder and a book open in her lap. The horse was asleep. She was reading. The book was a surveying manual which should not have surprised him, but somehow did. She looked up. "He just put himself there," she said with a gesture toward the horse's enormous head on her shoulder. "I didn't invite him. He does what he wants," William said. "Always has." "So do I," she said and turned back to the page. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment. He knew in that moment, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent 5 years avoiding a feeling, finally recognizing it beyond all possibility of denial, that Clara Whitfield had become the most important person in his daily life. Not because of what she did, though what she did was considerable, but because of who she was doing it as openly, stubbornly, honestly, without pretense or performance, exactly the same person in the barn as she was at the dinner table, as she was in the yard, as she was on the barn roof, as she was at the county documents. The same clear-eyed, unapologetic, quietly extraordinary person in every context he had seen her in. He turned and walked back to the house because staying and continuing to think that thought seemed inadvisable. She called after him from inside the barn. "I'm making beans tonight, the good ones, with the smoked pork." "All right," he said without turning around. He sat on the porch for a long time that evening before supper, watching the evening come in and thinking about walls and cracks in walls, and the specific problem of a crack that had gotten large enough that it was no longer accurate to call it a crack. He was still sitting there when Clara came to the door and said supper was ready. He went inside. He sat across from her at the table and ate the best beans he'd had in years, and answered when she asked about the South Pasture water situation, and listened when she told him about the surveying manual and what she'd learned from it. And the whole time, the thing he knew and hadn't said sat between them like a third person at the table, patient and waiting. After supper, she washed the dishes and he dried them because it had become somewhere in the past weeks what they did, and when the last dish was put away, she said goodnight and went out across the yard to the room near the barn, and William stood in the kitchen for a long moment after she was gone. Then he went and sat on the porch again in the full dark. He had built this life to be proof against loss. He had built it carefully from very specific and durable materials. And it had held. For 5 years it had held. And then a woman with bleeding feet had come through his gate and asked for a job, and the whole structure of it had started very quietly and very inevitably to become something else. He didn't know yet what to do with that. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. William was in the South Pasture when Clara came riding out to find him, and he knew before she said a word that something had happened because Clara did not interrupt his work without reason. She pulled up beside him and held out a folded document without preamble. "This came with the county courier an hour ago," she said. "You need to read it now." He read it. The letter was from the county land office, signed by the recorder himself, informing William Carter that a formal boundary dispute had been filed against the Carter Ranch property by Thomas Holloway, citing the 1871 irrigation agreement between Henry Holloway and Elias Carter as evidence of a continuing easement claim over the Eastern Water Access Corridor, which the letter carefully noted included the primary access point to Miller Creek. If the claim was upheld, William would lose legal control of the creek boundary. Without the creek, the South herd had no reliable water source within 2 miles. Moving them would require infrastructure he didn't have, and time he couldn't afford. And Holloway knew that. He had calculated exactly how long a cattle operation could survive with compromised water access, and he had done his arithmetic well. William read the letter twice. Then he folded it and held it and said nothing. "He filed it 4 days ago," Clara said. "Which means he filed it 2 days after we sent the formal termination notice to Billings." William looked up at her. "He was already preparing this when we filed," she said. "He saw the termination notice coming, probably had someone watching the county filings, and he accelerated. He wanted to get his claim on record before our termination could be properly processed." Her jaw was set. "He's good at this. He's been doing it a long time," William said. "How many other ranchers has he done it to?" William was quiet for a moment. "3 that I know of. Cole Patterson lost his East 40 acres 2 years ago. The Brennan family sold out entirely. People said it was their choice, but I knew Frank Brennan. He didn't choose anything. He was pushed." He looked at the letter again. Amos Wickfield lost his water rights to the North Creek branch. His operation's been struggling ever since. Clara was very still. 3 families, she said. The same pattern each time. Different specifics. Same method. William looked at her. Why? Because if it's the same method, she said, then it leaves the same kind of evidence. She took the letter back from his hand. I need to see those cases. The original filings, the agreements. Holloway used the county records for each dispute. If he's built the same structure 3 times, there are going to be seams in it. Places where the story doesn't hold. She met his eyes. Can you get me access to those records? He thought of Eli Marsh, who knew everyone and owed no particular loyalty to Thomas Holloway. He thought of Cole Patterson, who had taken his hat off in the barn. He thought of Frank Brennan's son, who was still in the area, and who William suspected had never entirely made his peace with what had happened to his family's land. I can get you access, he said. They rode back together, and by the time they reached the house, Clara had already started organizing what she knew into the precise mental architecture that William had come to recognize as her working mode, quiet on the outside, furiously active, underneath the way a river ran fastest below a calm surface. He sent 3 messages that afternoon. By the following morning, Cole Patterson was at the kitchen table. Patterson was a big man, broad-shouldered with the kind of weathered face that came from 40 years of outdoor work. He sat across from Clara with his hat in his hands and looked at her with the open appraisal of a man deciding how much to trust. And Clara looked back at him with the patient steadiness of someone who was used to being assessed and had stopped finding it offensive. William says you know something about land documents, Patterson said. I worked in a land agency for 2 years, Clara said. I've read more claim filings and dispute records than most county recorders. Tell me what happened with your East 40. Patterson told her. It took an hour and a half with Clara asking precise questions that pulled details out of him that he hadn't thought about in 2 years. Specific dates, specific language from the documents, the name of the notary who had witnessed the original agreement, the exact wording of the easement clause Holloway had cited. She wrote everything down in her small, careful hand, and when he was done, she sat back and looked at her notes and said, The notary. What about him? Patterson said. Silas Drummond. That's the man who witnessed your original grazing agreement. That's right. He witnessed William's father's irrigation agreement, too. It's on the document. She looked up. And I'm willing to bet he witnessed the Brennan agreement and the Wickfield agreement as well. She set down her pen. Drummond works for Holloway, not officially, not on paper, but if he's the notary on all 4 documents that Holloway later used to build easement claims, that's not coincidence. That's infrastructure. Patterson stared at her. You got that from the documents, he said. I got a thread from the documents, she said. Pulling it is something else. William had been sitting at the far end of the table listening. He said, Drummond left Red Hollow 8 months ago. Nobody knows where he went. Somebody knows, Clara said. She looked at Patterson. Did Holloway's lawyer handle the dispute filing against you? Randolph Ames, out of Billings. Same lawyer as the Wickfield case. Patterson frowned. I don't know. I never talked to Wickfield directly about it. I need to talk to Amos Wickfield, Clara said to William. I'll ride out there tomorrow, he said. She shook her head. I'll ride out there tomorrow. You need to be here in case Holloway's people come to look at the eastern boundary. I don't want that creek access unattended. Patterson looked between them with the expression of a man recalculating something. She's right, Patterson said to William, which was not a thing Patterson said to many people about many things. William looked at Clara. She was already looking back at her notes. All right, he said, but you're not riding to Wickfield's alone. I'll send you with Danny Reeves. Danny was 16 and the son of a neighboring family, and the only person William currently trusted to ride with Clara without requiring an explanation of why she was doing what she was doing. Danny had seen her handle thunder and had arrived at his own conclusions. Clara didn't argue. She just nodded and kept reading. Patterson left mid-afternoon, and William found himself standing in the kitchen watching Clara work at the table documents spread across it, her notes accumulating in neat columns, her pen moving steadily and feeling something he recognized from the afternoon with thunder on the barn roof, except sharper now, clearer. She was fighting for his ranch, not because he'd asked her to, not because it was her job, because she had looked at what Thomas Holloway was doing, and it had offended something fundamental in her, the same way that a poorly set fence post offended her, or a mistreated horse offended her, not personally, but categorically as a violation of the way things ought to be. She was the most remarkable person he had ever known. He had known it for a while. He was only now letting himself say it even inside his own head without immediately finding a reason to walk away from it. He made coffee and put a cup beside her without interrupting, and went out to check the creek boundary himself. The next morning, Clara rode out to Wickfield's with Danny Reeves, and William spent the day working the south pasture and not watching the road. He was extremely successful at not watching the road approximately 40% of the time. She came back at 4 in the afternoon with Danny behind her and Amos Wickfield riding beside her, and Wickfield had not been asked to come. He had decided to come himself, which told William everything he needed to know about the conversation that had happened at his property. Wickfield was 63, lean with a careful way of moving that suggested old injuries that had healed imperfectly. He shook William's hand and then looked at Clara. "She's right about Randolph Ames," he said without preamble. "Same lawyer for both cases. And she's right about the notary. Drummond witnessed my agreement too. I never thought to put those pieces together." "Where did your agreement come from?" Clara asked. "The original one Holloway used. Who found it?" Wickfield's expression shifted. "Holloway's man brought it to me. Said he'd found it in his employer's old records. Said he thought I should know about it before there was any misunderstanding." "And the timing?" 3 weeks after I refused Holloway's purchase offer." The three of them looked at each other. "He manufactures them," Clara said. "It came out very quiet and very certain. Or he finds old documents that are genuinely ambiguous, and he manufactures the interpretation. Either way, the notary is the key Drummond-certified documents that Holloway then used as the legal foundation for the disputes. If we can show that Drummond had a financial relationship with Holloway, the certifications become questionable, and if the certifications are questionable, the disputes built on them become questionable." "That's a large if," William said. "I know," she said. "But Drummond left 8 months ago. That's not a coincidence either. I think someone, possibly Holloway himself, arranged for him to leave before anyone started putting patterns together." She looked at Wickfield. "Does he have family, Drummond? Anyone local who might know where he went?" "He had a sister," Wickfield said slowly. "Married a man in Glendive. Helen, I think her name was. Helen Pratt." Clara looked at William. William felt something click into place in his chest, not a feeling exactly. More like the sound a latch made when the gate was properly secured. "I know a man in Glendive," he said. What happened 3 days later was something none of them had prepared for. Holloway moved faster than they had expected. He sent 2 men to the eastern boundary of the Carter property on a Thursday morning, not to trespass technically, but to stand at the boundary line with a survey stake and a document, and make it clear that Holloway was treating the creek access as already under his control, pending the court's ruling. It was theater, not legality. But it was effective theater. 2 large men standing at your water access with stakes and paper made a statement that didn't require a judge to deliver. William went out to meet them. Clara came with him. He had not asked her to. She had simply appeared beside him when he went to get his horse already mounted, and he had looked at her, and she had looked back at him, and he had decided the conversation wasn't worth having. The 2 men were employed by Holloway's lumber yard, and their names were Garrett and Luce, and they had the relaxed confidence of men who believed that the weight of the man who sent them was sufficient armor for any situation. Garrett did the talking. He was polite in a way that was specifically designed to make politeness feel like condescension. "Mr. Carter," he said, tipping his hat. "We're just here to mark the access corridor. Official business pursuant to the filed claim. You understand?" "I understand," William said. "You can take your stakes and go." Garrett smiled. "Now, Mr. Carter, the filing's already in with the county." "The filing is in dispute," Clara said. A counterfiling was submitted 4 days ago with supporting documentation. Until the court rules, the status of this boundary is legally unchanged. You have no standing here. Garrett looked at her. A long, slow look, the kind designed to communicate that he did not consider her a relevant party to the conversation. "Ma'am," he said with a particular intonation on the word that made it mean something entirely different from respect. "The counterfiling reference number is 1885-CR-447, Clara said, in exactly the same tone she had used before. "Filed with Recorder Simmons in the Yellowstone County office on Monday the 14th. If your employer's lawyer has not made him aware of it, that's a conversation worth having before you plant stakes on property you don't yet have the legal authority to mark." The silence that followed had a specific texture. Luce, who had not spoken, shifted his weight. Garrett's smile had gone somewhere else. "I'll need to consult with Mr. Holloway." "You do that?" William said. They left. William watched them go and did not look at Clara until the sound of their horses had faded, and when he did look at her, she was watching the road with an expression that was controlled and precise, and only barely concealing something that might have been fury. "Counterfiling reference number," he said. "Real," she said. "I filed it Monday. I didn't want to tell you until I knew it had gone through, and by the time I knew those two were already at our boundary." She turned to look at him. "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry." He stared at her. "You filed a legal counterclaim with the county recorder's office?" "Yes." "On behalf of my property?" "Yes." "Without asking me?" She held his gaze steadily. "I was going to ask you. And then I thought about what would happen if Holloway filed something else before we did, and I made a decision. If you want me to have asked first, I understand. But the filing is correct, and it needed to happen, and I—" She stopped. Looked away briefly, then back. "I would make the same decision again. I'm sorry that I should have told you first." He looked at her for a long moment. The thing about Clara Whitfield, he had learned, was that she did not apologize for her judgment. She apologized for her process when her process was imperfect. Those were different things, and most people never learn to distinguish between them. "Don't apologize," he said. "You were right." She exhaled, just slightly. "Come on," he said. "We've got work to do." What came next arrived not from the county office or from Holloway's lawyers, but from Margaret Holloway herself, and it came in the form of a gathering. The Ladies' Auxiliary of Red Hollow met the first Friday of every month at the church hall, and Margaret Holloway had been its chair for 9 years, which meant she had 9 years of accumulated social credit to spend, and she spent some of it on the first Friday of October, in a way that was designed to make Clara Whitfield's position in Red Hollow untenable. William heard about it from Eli Marsh, who heard about it from his wife, who had been in attendance and had come home troubled enough by what she witnessed to tell her husband directly. What Margaret had said in front of 30 women was that Clara Whitfield was a woman without family, without references, without history, who had appeared at a grieving widower's gate with nothing to her name and had inserted herself into his household under the guise of employment, and that any woman of sense could see what that meant and what it was likely to lead to, and that the decent women of Red Hollow had an obligation to make clear to William Carter that he was being taken advantage of before it was too late. 3 women had agreed loudly, 6 had agreed quietly, and the rest, Eli's wife reported, had sat in uncomfortable silence, which was not agreement, but was not disagreement either, and was enough for Margaret Holloway's purposes. William heard this, and felt something cold and controlled settle over him. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger. Something that came from years of watching people use respectability as a weapon, and knowing exactly how much damage it could do. He told Clara. He told her that evening at the table after supper, in the same direct way she always told him things, without softening it, without managing it, because she had never once asked him to manage things for her. She listened. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. "How many women in that room know me?" she asked. "Eli's wife. Maybe 1 or 2 others. And the rest know Margaret Holloway." They know her for 9 years, William said. Clara nodded slowly. She was looking at the table. Her hands, he noticed, were completely still, not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a person holding themselves carefully together. "They're not wrong that I arrived with nothing," she said. "That part is true." "Clara, I'm not feeling sorry for myself," she said with a quick, sharp look that confirmed it. "I'm thinking, there's a difference." She was quiet again. Then, "What I've built here is visible. The fence line, the barn roof, the accounts, thunder. Anyone who comes to this property can see the work. Anyone who has done business with you in the past 3 months can tell you whether it's been better or worse." She met his eyes. "The women in that room who know me even just slightly, are they the kind who talk?" He thought of Eli's wife, who had been troubled enough to tell her husband, which meant she was troubled enough to tell someone else if the occasion arose. He thought of a woman named Ruth Cassidy, who had come out to the ranch with her husband about a fence boundary question, and had watched Clara explain the survey documents with quiet authority, and who had said to Ruth's husband on the way home, William had this from the husband that she didn't know who that woman was, but she knew her type, and her type was solid. "Some of them," he said. "Then that's enough for now," Clara said. She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm not going to fight Margaret Holloway with words. I'm going to fight her with the same thing I fight everything with." "Work," he said. "Work," she confirmed. He wanted to say more. He was not entirely sure what more looked like, but he could feel the shape of it, something he wanted to put between her and Margaret Holloway's opinion. Something that would make clear to the world, and to her, that what she was in this house, and on this land, was not what Margaret Holloway had described. He didn't say it. But he thought about it for a long time that night. The answer from Glendive came 2 weeks later. The man William knew there was a former deputy named Cross, who owed William a favor from years back involving a cattle theft case, and a piece of information that had made the difference between a conviction and an acquittal on the right side, William's side. Cross was retired now, and did odd errands for people he respected, and finding Silas Drummond's sister Helen Pratt had taken him 9 days. The letter was 4 pages. Clara read it first because she was at the kitchen table when it arrived and William was in the barn, and by the time he came in, she was on the 3rd page, and her face had the specific quality of someone reading something that was confirming exactly what they'd suspected and finding no pleasure in being right. She handed him the letter when she was done. He read it. Helen Pratt Drummond's sister had been willing to talk to Cross for the same reason people often talk to strangers about things they couldn't say to neighbors. She was far away, and she was worried, and she had been carrying what she knew alone for 8 months. She confirmed that her brother Silas had left Red Hollow at Thomas Holloway's arrangement and with Holloway's money. She said Silas had told her when he left that he had done things in his work as a notary that he had not been entirely comfortable with, that some documents he had certified had not, in his professional view, been entirely what they purported to be. He had not been specific, but he had been frightened. He was currently in Missoula. Helen Pratt had an address. William set the letter down on the table. "We need a lawyer," Clara said. "Not just for the filing. For this." "I know one in Billings," he said. That was the second time he'd said it, and the situation was significantly more serious than the first time he'd said it. "Not Billings," she said. "We need someone closer. Someone who can move quickly if Holloway realizes we've found Drummond." She looked up at him. "And we need to get to Drummond before Holloway does. Once Holloway knows we have that address..." "How would Holloway know?" She looked at him steadily. "He knew when we filed the termination notice. He knew when we filed the counterclaim. He has someone watching the county records, and he probably has someone watching who William Carter sends letters to and receives letters from." She paused. "Mr. Carter, William, how long has Thomas Holloway been doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. "At least 8 years that I know of. A man who's been running this kind of operation for 8 years doesn't do it without intelligence," she said. "He knows things before he should know them. That's not luck. That's money put in the right places." She held his gaze. We need to move in the next 48 hours. Both of us. You find the lawyer. I'll draft the affidavit request to send to Drummond something that lays out what we know and what we need from him, and why coming forward now protects him more than staying hidden." She stood up. "And we tell no one. Not Patterson, not Wickfield, not Eli Marsh. Not yet." He looked at her across the table, this woman who had come here with nothing, who had rebuilt his fence and healed his horse, and filed his counterclaim, and uncovered the architecture of a fraud that had been dismantling his neighbors for 8 years, who was now standing in his kitchen with her hair coming out of its braid and fire in her eyes and a plan already half formed in her head, and felt something move through him that he did not try to name or manage or walk away from. "All right," he said. 48 hours. She nodded and sat back down and picked up her pen, and the scratch of it on paper was the only sound in the kitchen for a long time. And William Carter stood and watched her work, and understood with the absolute certainty of a man who has finally stopped arguing with the truth, that whatever happened next, he was not going to let her face it alone. He had spent 5 years building a life that didn't require anyone. She had spent 3 months making that life require her. He was done pretending he didn't know what that meant. The lawyer's name was George Aldrich, and he practiced out of a 2-room office above the dry goods store in a town called Hardin, 40 miles east of Red Hollow. William had met him once 3 years ago at a Cattlemen's Association meeting, and what he remembered about George Aldrich was that he talked slowly, thought fast, and had the particular quality of stillness that distinguished a man who was genuinely confident from a man who was performing it. He had also, at that same meeting, said something about Thomas Holloway that William had not forgotten, that Holloway was the kind of man who built everything on sand and spent his life making sure no one looked at the foundation. William rode to Hardin alone early on a Friday morning and was in Aldrich's office before 9. He laid out everything: the original 1871 irrigation agreement, the counter-filing Clara had submitted, the letter from Cross in Glendive, the pattern across the Patterson, Wickfield, and Brennan cases, the notary Silas Drummond, his departure, his sister's letter, the address in Missoula. He put it all on Aldrich's desk and sat back and let the lawyer read. Aldrich read for 45 minutes without speaking. Then he set the last page down and looked at William over the top of his reading glasses. "The woman who put this together," he said. "She's your ranch hand." "She is. She filed the counterclaim herself." "She did." Aldrich picked up the counterfiling again and read a section of it. Then he set it down again. "This is good work," he said. "The citation on the 1879 water rights statute is correct, and it's exactly the right citation. Most lawyers in this county would have missed it." He took off his glasses. "Who is she?" "Her name is Clara Whitfield. She worked 2 years at a land agency in Billings before she came to work for me." "She should have been a lawyer," Aldrich said. "She should have been a lot of things," William said. "What can you do with what I've brought you?" Aldrich leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers together. "The Drummond angle is the strongest play. If we can get a sworn affidavit from him acknowledging that he certified documents under pressure or inducement from Holloway, that opens the door to challenging every easement claim Holloway has built on those certifications, not just yours, Patterson's, Wickfield's, Brennan's estate." He paused. "But Drummond is the weak point. He left for a reason, and that reason is fear. Getting him to sign an affidavit means convincing him that talking is safer than staying quiet, and for a man who ran 8 months ago, that's not a small thing." "Clara is drafting the affidavit request," William said. "She wants to send it to him directly. Lay out what we know, what we need, and how his cooperation protects him." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "She's thought about this more than you have." "She generally has," William said without irony. The lawyer almost smiled. "Get me the affidavit request before you send it. I want to look at the language, and I want to be present when it's filed if Drummond agrees." He paused. "There's one more thing. If Holloway figures out that you've found Drummond before we have a signed affidavit, he will move to discredit him. He'll find something in Drummond's past, or he'll manufacture something, and he'll make sure the county knows about it before Drummond's testimony can carry any weight. That's how he works. The woman's research confirms the pattern. Aldrich met William's eyes. You have a time problem, Mr. Carter. 48 hours was an optimistic estimate. William rode back to Red Hollow with Aldrich's words sitting in his chest like a stone, and arrived to find Clara at the kitchen table with the affidavit request completed 3 pages in her small, precise hand, and Danny Reeves sitting across from her, being told in the calm, matter-of-fact way Clara told everyone everything that he was going to ride to the telegraph office in Billings tomorrow morning and send a message, and that he was not to tell anyone what was in it or where he was going. Danny was 17. He looked at Clara with the complete uncomplicated devotion of a young man who had decided she was the most capable person he had ever met, and that following her instructions was simply the sensible course of action. "Yes, ma'am," he said. William sat down. "Aldrich wants to see the language before we send it." Clara slid the pages across the table without comment. He read them. The affidavit request was not what he had expected. It was not threatening, and it was not pleading. It was honest. It laid out in plain language what Clara had pieced together from the documents and from Cross's letter, the pattern of the disputes, the role of the notary, certifications, the evidence of Holloway's coordination, and it said to Drummond directly that his departure from Red Hollow had been noted, and that his current situation was likely more precarious than he understood, because a man who had participated in a fraud even under pressure was as liable as the man who ordered it, unless he chose to be a witness instead of a defendant. It said that the people filing the affidavit request were not his enemies. It said that what they needed from him was the truth, and that the truth properly documented and submitted was the only thing that protected any of them. William read it twice. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said. Not arrogant, just certain the way she was certain about the fence posts and Thunder's lungs and the water rights statute. "Will Aldrich approve it?" "He'll want to adjust the legal language in the 3rd paragraph. The rest he'll leave alone." "Then Danny rides on Monday," she said. Danny rode on Monday. What came back was not what they expected. Drummond did not reply to the telegraph. He showed up. He arrived at the Carter Ranch on a Thursday afternoon, 8 days after Danny sent the message, driving a rented buggy from the Hardin livery and wearing the look of a man who had not slept properly in a very long time. He was 60 slight, with a notary's precise hands and the eyes of someone who had been watching over his own shoulder for months and was exhausted by it. Clara was the one who met him at the gate. William watched from the porch and saw them. The small man in the buggy and the woman who walked up to his gate without hesitation and stood there, and the conversation that lasted about 3 minutes, and then Drummond climbing down from the buggy and following her toward the house, with the particular posture of a man who had made a decision he was terrified of and was committed to anyway. They sat at the kitchen table. William and Clara on one side, Drummond across from them, his hands around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from. "I want to understand," Drummond said, "what you can actually do for me. Not what you hope to do, what you can actually do." "We can't guarantee anything," Clara said. "I won't tell you we can. What I can tell you is that George Aldrich, who you should know, is a man with a clean record and a good reputation in this district, believes that a cooperating witness who comes forward with documentation before the court proceedings begin is in a categorically different position from someone implicated in the fraud after the fact." "How different?" "The difference between being the man who helped us understand what happened," Clara said, "and being the man Holloway names as independently responsible when his own position becomes untenable." She held the old man's gaze. "Because that is what he will do, Mr. Drummond. The moment his lawyers understand how much we know, they will need someone to redirect the court's attention toward. You have been out of his reach for 8 months. That won't feel safe to him much longer." Drummond looked at his coffee cup. "He paid me," he said, "for each certification. Above my standard fee. Considerably above." He paused. "I told myself the documents were technically valid, that the agreements were real, that all I was doing was certifying that the signatures were genuine, which they were. The signatures were genuine." He looked up. "The context around them was not." "Meaning," William said, Meaning the agreements were real documents, Drummond said. Signed by real parties. But the parties who signed them didn't understand what they were signing in at least 2 cases. And in one case, he stopped, looked at the table. In one case, the document I certified was not the document the signing party had reviewed. There was a substitution. I was aware of it. His voice dropped. I certified it anyway. The kitchen was very quiet. Which case? Clara asked. Brennan, he said. Frank Brennan. He had reviewed one document. What he signed, what I watched him sign without telling him, was a different document. The easement clause was different, more expansive. He looked at William. I told myself he wouldn't notice, that the practical difference was small, that Holloway only wanted the access, not the land. He shook his head. Brennan sold out entirely 8 months later. His family left the county. William looked at Clara. She was watching Drummond with an expression that was not warm and was not cold. It was the expression of someone receiving information that mattered and setting their own reaction to it aside until the information was fully collected. Will you sign an affidavit? She said. Everything you've told us, every case. The payments, the substitution in the Brennan case, the nature of the arrangements. All of it. Drummond was quiet for a long time. If I sign, he said, and Holloway is not successfully prosecuted, if the case falls apart somehow, if the judge is... He didn't finish the sentence. If the case falls apart, Clara said, you will have a signed affidavit on record with the county establishing your role as a cooperating witness. That affidavit, regardless of the outcome, changes your legal position. It's not a guarantee, but it is a wall between you and the worst outcome. She paused. Mr. Drummond, you came here. You drove from Missoula. You didn't write back, you came. I think you already decided. He looked at her for a long moment. You're a remarkable woman, he said. I'm a practical woman, she said. Sign the affidavit. He signed it the next morning with George Aldrich present in the Carter kitchen, and William watched Clara witness the signature with the same focused calm she brought to every piece of work she put her hands to. And he thought about what Aldrich had said. She should have been a lawyer, and thought that Aldrich was right, and also missing the point, because Clara was exactly what she was, and what she was had just done more legal work in 3 weeks than most lawyers managed in a year. Aldrich filed the affidavit with the county court that afternoon. The following morning, the story had already reached Red Hollow. Not the full story, not yet, but enough. Enough for people to know that Silas Drummond had come to the Carter Ranch and then to the county courthouse with George Aldrich, and that what had been filed was significant, and that Thomas Holloway's lawyer, Randolph Ames, had been seen leaving the county recorder's office looking like a man who had received information that required him to reassess several things simultaneously. Eli Marsh told William about Ames's expression with a quiet satisfaction that he didn't bother to conceal. Cole Patterson rode over the same afternoon. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at William and then at Clara, who was repairing a hinge on the barn door, and said, "Is it true Drummond signed?" "He signed," William said. Patterson looked at Clara. She had not stopped working on the hinge. "She found him," Patterson said. It was not a question. "She found the thread," William said. "She pulled it." Patterson was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat over in his hands. Then he walked over to where Clara was crouching at the barn door, and he stood beside her and waited until she looked up. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I've been in this county for 22 years. I lost my East 40 to that man, and I thought there was nothing to be done about it." He paused. "I was wrong about that. I want to say thank you." Clara looked up at him. Something moved across her face, not quite surprise, but adjacent to it. The expression of someone who had not expected to be thanked. "It's not done yet," she said. "No," Patterson agreed, "but it's further along than it was." He put his hat back on. "Whatever you need. From me, from my crew. You ask." He left, and Clara went back to the hinge, and William stood watching her, and felt the particular complicated weight of a man who understood that something was happening in his county that was larger than his property dispute, and had been made possible by a woman who had arrived at his gate with bleeding feet and a cloth bag, and the absolute refusal to be less than she was. The court date was set for 3 weeks out. Those 3 weeks had a different quality than anything that had come before. The work continued. It always continued because a ranch did not pause for legal proceedings, but underneath the daily rhythms was a current of tension that both of them felt and neither of them discussed directly. Holloway's lawyers filed 3 separate motions challenging the admissibility of Drummond's affidavit. Aldrich countered each one. The county judge, a man named Harold Fitch, who had been on the bench for 11 years and was known for reading documents with the thoroughness of a man who intended to actually understand them, reviewed every filing personally. During those 3 weeks, 2 things happened that neither William nor Clara had anticipated. The first was that Frank Brennan's son came to the ranch. His name was Patrick Brennan. He was 26, and he had been living in Red Hollow working at the livery for the past year. He had heard about Drummond's affidavit from Patterson, and he had come, he said, because he wanted to know if there was anything in what Drummond had signed that addressed what had happened to his father. Clara brought him inside and gave him coffee, and told him clearly, and without softening it, what Drummond had said about the Brennan case. The document substitution. The clause that had been changed. The nature of what Frank Brennan had signed without knowing what he was signing. Patrick Brennan listened with his hands flat on the table and his face very still. When she finished, he said, "My father thought he had made a mistake. He thought he'd missed something in the document. He blamed himself for losing the land." His voice was controlled, but only just. "He died 2 years ago. He died thinking it was his fault." The kitchen was quiet. "It was not his fault," Clara said. "And that is now on the record." Patrick Brennan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Is there anything I can add to this? Any testimony?" "Talk to Aldrich," she said. "Tell him everything your father told you about the signing. Every detail. Even the things that seem small." She paused. "Your father was not careless, Mr. Brennan. He was deceived by a man who was very good at deception. The difference between those 2 things matters, and we're going to make it matter in court." Patrick Brennan left an hour later, having agreed to speak with Aldrich the following week. After he was gone, William stood in the kitchen and looked at Clara, who was sitting at the table with her notes and her pen already back at work. And he said, without quite intending to say it out loud, "Do you know what you've done?" She looked up. "In 3 months," he said. "Coming here, looking at those documents, following that thread." He paused. "You didn't just save this ranch." She held his gaze. "I know," she said quietly. "Frank Brennan's son is going to be able to tell his children that his grandfather didn't make a mistake," William said. "The Wickfield operation might recover. Patterson might get his East 40 back." He shook his head. "None of that would have happened." Clara set down her pen. "None of it would have happened," she said, "if you hadn't hired me." She looked at him steadily. "You took a risk on a barefoot woman who showed up at your gate asking for a job. Most men in this county would have sent me away." She paused. "You didn't." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "Clara," and stopped. She waited. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I want to say it plainly because I'm not good at the other way." "You're better at it than you think," she said. "But go ahead." He took a breath. "When you first came here, I thought I was doing something practical. Hiring someone capable. Solving a problem." He paused. "That lasted about a week." She was very still. "You became—" He stopped again. "Started over. This ranch needed you. I knew that early, but that's not—" He looked at his hands and then back at her. "I needed you. Not the work you do, though I won't pretend the work isn't considerable. I mean, I needed you to be here. I needed to eat supper across from you and hear what you thought about the survey documents and watch you talk to Thunder and sit on that porch in the evening and know that someone was in this house who—" He stopped. "I'm not saying this well." "You're saying it fine," she said. Her voice was careful and very quiet. "I don't want you to go," he said. "I don't mean when the court case is finished, I mean ever." He held her gaze. "I want you to stay here, not as an employee, as—" He paused. "As the person who belongs here, if that's something you want." The kitchen was silent except for the fire in the stove. Clara looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he felt the silence as a physical thing pressing against his chest. Then she said, "William Carter, I walked 22 miles to get here." He looked at her. "I wasn't walking away from something," she said. "I was walking toward something. I just didn't know yet what it was." She held his gaze. "I know now." He exhaled. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and they stayed like that for a long moment. Two people who had each in their own way spent years building walls against the world, sitting at a kitchen table in the Montana Territory, with the fire going in the stove and the evening coming on outside holding on. The second thing that happened during those 3 weeks was the one that changed everything in Red Hollow. Margaret Holloway came to the ranch. She came alone on a Tuesday morning driving her own buggy, and when Clara answered the door, William was in the south pasture, and Clara was working at the kitchen table. When she heard the buggy in the yard, she found Margaret standing on the porch with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hostile, not friendly, something more complicated than either. "Miss Whitfield," Margaret said. "Mrs. Holloway," Clara said. She did not open the door wider. She stood in the doorway and waited. Margaret Holloway was a woman who had spent 30 years being the most important person in every room she entered, and what it cost her to say what she said next was visible in the set of her jaw and the particular straightness of her posture. "I have been informed," she said carefully, "of the nature of Drummond's affidavit. My husband's lawyer sent a summary to our attorney in Billings, and the copy came to my attention." She paused. "I was not aware of the substitution in the Brennan case." Clara said nothing. "I want you to know," Margaret said, "that I was not aware of it." "I believe you," Clara said. And she did not, because she thought Margaret Holloway was a good woman, but because the document substitution was the kind of thing a man like Thomas Holloway would not have told his wife about, because it was the kind of thing that made a scheme look like a crime. Margaret looked at her. "I have said things about you in this town that were unkind and unfounded." Clara held her gaze. "I was told certain things about you by my husband," Margaret continued, "and I repeated them because I trusted his judgment. I understand now that his judgment in some areas is not what I believed it to be." Her voice was completely controlled, which Clara understood was the only way this woman knew how to do anything difficult. "That does not excuse what I said, but I wanted you to know the source of it." "Thank you for coming," Clara said. "Mrs. Holloway, for what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you've been married to a dishonest man for a long time, and it's made you into a weapon." He pointed at people who were inconvenient to him. She paused. "That's not a comfortable thing to hear, but I think you already know it." Margaret Holloway stood very still on the porch. Then slowly she nodded, just once. "The court date," she said. "Is there anything—" She stopped, started again. "If Thomas loses the case, the water rights dispute against your property falls. The entire structure falls." She looked at Clara steadily. "I cannot testify against my husband, but I am telling you that I will not testify for him." She went back to her buggy. Clara stood in the doorway and watched her leave. When William came back from the south pasture that afternoon, Clara told him what had happened. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "She came herself," he said. "She didn't send a message. She drove out here." "Yes." "That took something," he said. "It did," Clara agreed. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Clara said, "that Thomas Holloway built everything on what other people owed him. His wife's loyalty, the county's deference, the law's willingness to look the other way." She paused. "And I'm thinking that those things are less reliable than he thought." The court date arrived on a gray October morning that smelled of coming winter. The county courthouse in Red Hollow was a single large room with wooden benches and a judge's bench at the front and a wood stove in the corner that was working hard against the cold. By the time William and Clara arrived with George Aldrich, every bench was full. Patterson was there. Wickfield was there. Patrick Brennan was in the second row. Eli Marsh and his wife were near the back. And scattered through the room were men and women who had come because word had reached them through the networks of a small county where information traveled on horseback and over fences that something significant was happening, that a case was being heard, that was about more than one ranch's water rights, that it was about the way business had been done in this valley for 8 years, and whether it was going to continue. Thomas Holloway arrived with 2 lawyers and sat at the opposite table without looking at anyone. He was 60, heavy-set, with the face of a man accustomed to outcomes going his way. He glanced at Clara once, a brief, assessing look, and then looked away. She looked back at him without flinching. Judge Harold Fitch took the bench at 9 o'clock and called the room to order, and the proceedings began. What unfolded over the next 4 hours was less dramatic than a battle, and more brutal than one. It was the careful, relentless dismantling of a structure that had been built with great care and survived for 8 years because no one had looked at it from enough angles at once to see what it was. Aldrich presented the counter-filing. He presented Drummond's affidavit. He presented the pattern documentation across all 4 cases, the same notary, the same lawyer, the same sequence of offer, rejection, followed by dispute. He presented Patrick Brennan's testimony about his father. He presented Amos Wickfield's account of the timing of the dispute against his water rights. Holloway's lawyers objected repeatedly. Fitch overruled most of it with the patience of a man who had read every document in advance and was not going to be surprised by anything that was presented. The moment that the room shifted, the moment when the quality of the silence changed, and everyone present understood which direction the day was going, came when Aldrich read a specific passage from Drummond's affidavit. The passage describing the Brennan document substitution. The passage where Drummond, in his careful notary's hand, had written, "I was aware that the document presented for signature was not the document the party had reviewed. I certified it nonetheless. I was compensated for this specific act by Thomas Holloway in the amount of $40 paid in cash on the evening of March 14, 1882. The room was completely silent when Aldrich finished reading. Patrick Brennan in the second row put his hand over his face. Thomas Holloway looked at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at the judge. Judge Fitch looked at his notes and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to take a recess of 1 hour, and when I return, I want to hear from Mr. Holloway's counsel regarding their position on the admissibility question." He looked at Holloway's table over the top of his glasses. "I would counsel that position to be considered very carefully." During the recess, William and Clara stood in the hallway outside the courtroom. Clara had her arms crossed and was looking at the wall across from her. William stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "Fitch read everything." "Yes," William said. "He's going to rule in your favor." "Our favor," William said. She looked at him. "This is yours too," he said. "What happens in that room, whatever comes out of it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the wall. "I want it to hold for the others," she said. "Not just us. Patterson's land, the Wickfield water rights, the Brennan estate." Her jaw was set. "If it only fixes our problem and leaves their standing, it's not enough." "Aldrich filed for all of them," William said. "It's in the record." "I know," she said. "I wrote most of it." He almost smiled. "I know you did." When court resumed, Holloway's lawyers argued for 40 minutes. Fitch listened. Then he asked 3 questions, each of which was a precise scalpel aimed at the weakest point of Holloway's legal position, and each answer from Holloway's counsel made the position worse. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Judge Harold Fitch ruled. The boundary dispute claim was dismissed. The 1871 irrigation agreement was found to have been properly terminated by the formal notice filed in August. Drummond's affidavit was entered fully into the county record. A formal investigation referral was issued to the district attorney's office regarding the Brennan document substitution, and in a sentence that was only 3 lines long, but that Eli Marsh later said he heard clearly from the back of the room. Fitch stated that the pattern of conduct documented across the 4 property disputes raised concerns that extended beyond the specific claims before the court, and that the county recorder's office had been directed to flag any filings involving the named parties pending review. The room erupted, not loudly, not with cheering, but with the kind of noise a room made when 30 people let out a breath they had been holding for different lengths of time and began talking to each other in urgent, relieved, disbelieving voices. Thomas Holloway stood and left the courtroom without looking at anyone. Clara did not watch him go. She was looking at Patrick Brennan, who was shaking George Aldrich's hand with both of his, and whose face had the stunned, undone look of a man receiving something he had believed for 2 years was permanently lost. Beside him, Amos Wickfield was standing very straight and very still, and the look on his face was the look of a man reclaiming his dignity 1 moment at a time. Patterson appeared at Clara's shoulder. "How'd you know?" he said. "The first time you looked at those documents, how did you know what you were looking at?" She thought about it for a moment. "I've read a lot of dishonest documents," she said. "They have a particular quality. The language is slightly too careful in the wrong places. Like someone was trying to make sure a thing was true in the letter and not in the spirit." She looked at him. "Your East 40 case was the same. The easement language was drafted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted to make sure it would hold up while meaning something different than it appeared to mean." Patterson was quiet for a moment. "You're going to get my land back." "Aldrich is going to try," she said. "I'm going to help him." Patterson put out his hand. She shook it. William watched her from across the room, standing there in the courthouse in her worn dress, with her work-roughened hands and her level eyes shaking Cole Patterson's hand while 3 men waited to speak to her. And George Aldrich was making notes, and Patrick Brennan was wiping his face with his handkerchief, and understood with the completeness of a man who has run out of ways to misunderstand something what kind of person she was and what kind of life she had chosen to build, and what it meant that she had chosen to build part of it here. She looked up and found him watching her. Across the crowded room, with all the noise and motion of a courthouse that was processing something significant, she just looked at him. And he looked back, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. The ride home from the courthouse was quiet, in the way that only comes after something large has finished. William drove the wagon and Clara sat beside him, and the road back to the Carter Ranch unrolled under the wheels in the late afternoon light, and neither of them spoke for a long stretch of it. Not because there was nothing to say. Because what had happened that day was the kind of thing that needed space around it before words could find their proper size. It was Clara who spoke first. "Patterson's going to file for the East 40, she said. "Aldrich thinks the ruling gives him enough foundation to challenge the original easement claim directly. It won't be fast, but it's possible now in a way it wasn't this morning." "I know," William said. "And the district attorney's referral, that's going to take time too. Fitch can issue a referral, but he can't make the DA move quickly. Holloway still has money, and money buys patience from lawyers." She paused. "We'll need to keep the documentation organized and current for whenever they call for it." "We'll do that," William said. She nodded and looked at the road ahead. He glanced at her profile. She was doing what she always did after a thing was finished, immediately thinking about what came next, what needed to be maintained, what couldn't be allowed to lapse. It was one of the things that made her extraordinary, and also one of the things that he had come to understand sometimes stood between her and the simple act of letting herself feel what she had earned the right to feel. "Clara," he said. Stop thinking about Patterson's East 40 for 10 minutes. She turned to look at him. "What happened today?" he said. "Let it be what it is for a little while, before you start on the next thing." She held his gaze for a moment. Then something in her face shifted, a small, slow release, like a fist uncurling. She turned back to the road. "All right," she said. They rode the rest of the way home in a different kind of silence. The comfortable kind. The kind that had its own warmth to it. Thunder was at the paddock fence when they pulled in, tracking the sound of the wagon with his ears, and when Clara climbed down, he moved to the fence rail and put his nose toward her shoulder, with the expectant patience of an animal who had learned that she always came back. She put her hand on his face. "Good boy," she said, quietly, to the horse, not to anyone else. William unhitched the wagon and put the horse up and came back to find Clara still at the paddock fence, with Thunder not doing anything in particular, just standing there with her hand on his neck and her face in a kind of peace he had not seen on her before. Not the focused stillness of her working mode. Something softer. Something she didn't often let herself have. He stood and watched her for a moment. Then he went inside and built up the fire and started supper himself for the first time in 3 months, because it occurred to him that she had been thinking about everyone else's land, and everyone else's rights, and everyone else's future all day, and the least he could do was make sure there was hot food waiting when she came in. She came through the door 20 minutes later, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and looked at him standing at the stove. "What are you doing?" she said. "Cooking supper," he said. She looked at the pot. "You're burning it." "I am not burning it." "You're about to burn it." She crossed the kitchen, gently moved him aside with one hand, and took over the stirring. She tasted it, made a face, added salt, tasted it again. He stood beside her and watched. "It was fine," he said. "It was getting there," she said charitably. He laughed. She looked up at him when he did it, that quick, surprised look she still got sometimes when he laughed, as though she had not entirely gotten used to the sound of it, as though it still registered as something worth noting. And maybe it was. He didn't laugh often, but he laughed more than he had in 5 years, and the difference was entirely her. They ate supper at the kitchen table and talked about ordinary things, the South Pasture water situation, the hay supply going into winter, the hinge on the barn door that was going to need replacing properly before the cold set in. Normal things, ranch things. The things that were always there regardless of court dates and document fraud and the collapse of Thomas Holloway's 8-year scheme. The ranch didn't care about any of that. The ranch needed its hay and its fences and its water, and it needed them regardless. But underneath the ordinary conversation, something was different. Something had shifted in the quality of the space between them, and they both knew it, and it was not uncomfortable, but it was present, and it was waiting. After supper, Clara washed the dishes, and William dried them the way they always did, and when the last dish was put away, she turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "You're always thinking." "About what you said," she said. "Before the court date. In this kitchen." He held her gaze. "You said you wanted me to stay," she said. "Not as an employee." "I meant it." "I know you meant it," she said. "I want to make sure you understand what that means, what staying means, for me." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not easy to live with. I have opinions about everything, and I don't keep them to myself. I'll read your documents without asking and file things with the county before I've had the conversation I should have had first." She paused. "I'll care for this land like it's mine, because I can't do anything halfway. And I'll argue with you when I think you're wrong, which will be fairly regularly because you're stubborn, and so am I." "I know all of that," he said. "I know you know it," she said. "I'm saying it anyway. Because the last time I stayed somewhere, I stayed because I thought it was what I was supposed to do. And when it ended, I decided that the next time I stayed anywhere, I would stay with my eyes open." She held his gaze. "My eyes are open, William." He crossed the kitchen. He was not a man who moved without purpose, and he moved toward her with the same directness he brought to everything he did. No hesitation, no performance. And he stopped in front of her and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and he said, "Stay." Just that. She exhaled. "I already told you I would." "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it again." She smiled. Not the small, controlled smile she used in public, the one that didn't give too much away. The real one. The one he had seen on her face in the barn with Thunder. The one she'd given him the first night she cooked in this kitchen. The one that belonged entirely to her, and that she gave to almost no one. He put his hand against her face, and she turned into it slightly, the way Thunder did when she put her palm to his neck, and they stayed like that for a moment, just that, just the warmth of his hand and her face, and the fire in the stove, and the October dark outside the window. Then he said, "I think we should get married." She blinked. "You think—" "I know," he corrected. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking not about whether he understood, because that was already settled. About something else, about what it meant, and what it would look like, and how it would be received, and all the practical forward-looking calculations that her mind ran automatically. "The town is going to talk," she said. "The town has been talking since the day you arrived," he said. "They haven't stopped us yet." She almost laughed. "No, they haven't. Eli Marsh's wife will be happy about it," he said. "She's been looking at us like we're a problem she wants to solve since July." "She told me that herself," Clara said. "Last week at the dry goods store, she said, and I'm quoting her exactly, that it was obvious to anyone with eyes." "She's not wrong," he said. Clara looked at him. "William Carter, are you actually proposing to me in your kitchen after I fixed your burnt supper?" "The supper wasn't burnt," he said. And yes, she looked at him for a long, steady moment, and what he saw in her eyes was not uncertainty. It was the look she got when something aligned properly, when a fence post said exactly right, when a document revealed what she suspected, when Thunder's breathing smoothed back to normal. The look of a thing that had found its correct place. "Yes," she said. He kissed her then, and she put both hands against his chest, and the fire crackled in the stove, and outside the Carter ranch sat quiet and whole under the October stars. The wedding was small, held at the courthouse in Hardin on the first Saturday of November, with George Aldrich as witness, and Danny Reeves standing in the back looking like someone had told him the best news of his life. Eli Marsh drove out with his wife, who cried productively and without apology, and told Clara she looked lovely, which Clara received with the particular grace of a woman who is not accustomed to being told she looked lovely, and was learning to accept it. Cole Patterson came. Amos Wickfield came. Patrick Brennan came, and stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but something between the two, the expression of a man attending a good thing that was happening in a place where a hard thing had also happened, and finding that the two could coexist. Thomas Holloway did not come, which surprised no one. Margaret Holloway sent a note. It said, "I wish you both well." Nothing more. Clara read it and set it down and did not say what she thought about it, because what she thought about it was complicated, and the day was not a complicated day. The day was simple. The day was just this. When Judge Fitch, who was presiding at Aldrich's request, and who had agreed with the unruffled willingness of a man who considered it a reasonable follow-on to last month's proceedings, asked William if he took Clara Whitfield to be his wife. William said yes, with the direct, unequivocal certainty of a man who had been certain about very few things in 5 years, and was relieved to be certain about something again. When he asked Clara the same question, she said yes, and then, after the briefest pause, added, "Absolutely." Fitch raised an eyebrow. "She means it emphatically," William said. "I gathered," Fitch said, and proceeded. The ride back to Red Hollow from Hardin was not quiet this time. Danny Reeves rode ahead and told everyone he passed, which meant that by the time William and Clara came through Red Hollow in the wagon, Eli Marsh had already put the word out at the general store, and 3 people waved from the boardwalk, and a woman Clara barely knew called her name and said congratulations with genuine warmth. And Clara sat beside her husband on the wagon seat and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she belonged somewhere. Not to someone, not to a place exactly, but to a life. To a life that was hers in the fullest sense, one she had built with her own hands, one she had chosen with her eyes open, one that had chosen her back. Winter came to the Carter Ranch in the second week of November, and it came hard. But the hay was in, the barn was repaired, the herd was healthy. Thunder had gained back the weight he had lost in summer, and moved through the paddock with the easy assurance of an animal in excellent condition. The fence line on the north pasture had never been stronger. The kitchen was warm, and the table was set for 2 every evening, and the books were balanced in Clara's precise hand, and the ranch accounts were in better shape than they had been in 7 years. And every morning William Carter woke before first light and lay in the dark for a few minutes before he got up, listening to the sound of the ranch in winter, the wind and the distant cattle and the creak of the house, and felt the particular solid warmth of a life that had weight to it again. Substance. The feeling of a thing that mattered. He had spent 5 years building a life that was designed not to be lost. He had succeeded at that. He had built something that couldn't break because he had removed from it everything that could. He had not understood what that cost until Clara showed him. The district attorney's investigation into Thomas Holloway began in January. It was a slow process, as Clara had predicted, moving through the machinery of law with the grinding patience of an institution that was thorough but not quick. Holloway hired 2 additional lawyers and filed a series of motions that delayed the initial proceedings until March. But Drummond's affidavit held. Aldrich held. And the documentation that Clara had organized and maintained held above all, because it was precise and complete and built on a foundation that had been assembled with the care of someone who had spent 2 years learning how dishonest documents were constructed and had decided to build an honest one instead. By spring, 3 things had happened that the county had not expected. The first was that Randolph Ames Holloway's longtime lawyer withdrew from the case in February, citing a conflict of interest that he declined to elaborate on publicly. The legal community in Billings understood what the conflict was. Ames had billed Holloway for work that was under scrutiny, difficult to distinguish from participation in the fraud itself, but the official record simply showed a withdrawal, and the new lawyers Holloway hired had to start from considerably further back. The second was that Cole Patterson's challenge to the East 40 easement was heard by Judge Fitch in March and ruled in Patterson's favor. The ruling cited the Drummond affidavit directly, which meant that what Clara had built in October was actively returning land to a man who had lost it 2 years ago. Patterson came to the ranch the day after the ruling with a bottle of whiskey that he said he had been saving for something worth celebrating and had begun to doubt would ever arrive. He sat at the Carter kitchen table and poured 3 glasses and raised his and said, "To Clara Whitfield." Then he corrected himself. Clara Carter. Clara picked up her glass. "To Frank Brennan," she said, "who didn't make a mistake." Patterson's face did something that required him to look away for a moment. They drank. The third thing was quieter, but in its own way the most significant. Margaret Holloway moved out of the Holloway house in late February. She went to stay with her sister in Billings, and she did not say publicly what had happened, and she did not need to because the county understood the shape of a thing even when it wasn't spelled out. What the county also understood quietly, through the networks of small-town knowledge that moved faster than any newspaper, was that Margaret Holloway had not testified for her husband, that she had not in fact assisted him in any way, and that the woman she had spent months publicly disparaging had in the end done more for the integrity of this county than Margaret had done in 9 years as chair of the Ladies' Auxiliary. Clara never mentioned it. She did not consider it a victory over Margaret because it had never been a contest. Margaret Holloway was a woman who had built her life on one man's version of the world, and when that version collapsed, the life underneath it became visible, and what was visible was not as solid as it had seemed. That was Margaret's reckoning, not Clara's to claim. But one afternoon in April, Eli Marsh's wife, whose name was Helen, and who had become over the winter something Clara would cautiously have described as a friend, told Clara that Margaret Holloway had written to 3 women in Red Hollow from Billings, and in those letters she had said things about Clara's character that were the precise opposite of what she had said from the Ladies' Auxiliary chair in October. Clara received this information without visible reaction. Helen watched her. "You're not going to say anything about that." "What would I say?" Clara said. "Most people would say it was about time," Helen said. Clara thought about it for a moment. "She came to my door before the trial," she said. "She told me she hadn't known about the Brennan substitution. I believed her. Everything she's done since then has been consistent with that." She looked at Helen. "People aren't what their worst moment looks like. Most of them are trying to figure out the right thing and failing partway through." Helen was quiet for a moment. You're more generous than she deserves. I'm practical, Clara said. Anger at Margaret Holloway doesn't fix the fence. Helen laughed. You are the most unusual woman I have ever met. I've been told that before, Clara said. Usually not kindly. I mean it kindly, Helen said. Clara looked at her. I know you do, she said. Thank you. Thomas Holloway's legal proceedings concluded in July, 14 months after Judge Fitch's initial ruling. The outcome was not a dramatic courtroom moment. It was a settlement negotiated over 2 weeks of backroom meetings between Holloway's lawyers and the district attorney's office that resulted in Holloway paying significant financial restitution to the affected parties, formally surrendering the disputed water access claims, and accepting a permanent prohibition on filing property claims in Yellowstone County for a period of 10 years. He did not go to prison. Clara had expected that he wouldn't. A man with enough money and enough lawyers rarely went to prison for the kind of crime that happened on paper, and she had made her peace with that reality before the proceedings began. What mattered was the record. What mattered was that the pattern was documented, and the damages were paid, and the land that could be returned was returned, and the water rights that had been taken were restored. What mattered was that Frank Brennan's name was in that record as a man who had been deceived, not careless. Patrick Brennan came to the ranch the day the settlement was announced. He sat at the kitchen table. It seemed like every significant thing happened at that table. Clara had thought more than once, and she was not wrong, and told them both that the Brennan estate had received the settlement payment, and that he was thinking about buying back the land his father had lost. Can you afford it? William asked. With the settlement almost, Patrick said. I'd need to borrow the difference. William looked at Clara. She looked at Patrick. How much difference? He told her. She was quiet for a moment, working the numbers in her head in the way she worked everything precisely quickly without drama. William, she said. Yes, he said, before she'd said anything else. Patrick looked between them. I haven't asked anything yet. You were going to, Clara said, and the answer is yes. We'll lend you the difference at 4% over 3 years, which is below what any bank in this county will offer you. And you'll sign a proper note with Aldrich, so it's all on record. She paused. Your father's land should be in Brennan hands. That's the right outcome. Patrick Brennan looked at her for a long moment. Why? He said. You don't owe me anything. You've already done. Because I can, Clara said simply. And because it's right. She met his eyes. And because your father was failed by every system that should have protected him, and the least this county can do is give his son a fair chance to rebuild what was taken. Patrick Brennan bought his father's land back in September. He worked it himself, and it was hard, and there were seasons that tested him, and he came to Clara more than once in the years that followed, with questions about documents and water rights, and the particular kind of patient legal knowledge that she had built from 2 years of reading dishonest work and learning to construct the honest version. She always answered. She never charged him for it. The Carter Ranch by the winter of 1886 was not simply surviving. It was prospering. The herd was at its largest in a decade. The hay operation had expanded. The accounts that Clara managed were clear and current and showed for the first time since Eleanor Carter's death the particular shape of a ranch that was being run by 2 people who were both fully present to it. William handled the land and the cattle and the physical work with the same driven precision he had always brought to it. Clara handled the documents and the accounts and the negotiations and the relationships with suppliers, with neighbors, with the county. And she did it with such unassuming competence that most people within a year had stopped finding it remarkable and simply accepted it as the way things were on the Carter Ranch, which was fine with her. She had never needed to be remarkable. She had only ever needed to be herself. One evening in December, about a year after the trial, William came in from the south pasture to find Clara at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand and an expression he couldn't quite read. He hung up his coat. What is it? She looked up. A letter from a woman in Billings. Her name is Ruth Aldane. Her husband runs a small operation east of the city, and they're in a dispute with a larger landowner over water access. She set the letter down. She heard about our case. She heard about what I did with the documents. She paused. She's asking if I can help. William sat down across from her. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I want to help her," she said. "I know what it looks like, a document dispute with a larger operator. I know the shape of it. I know where to look." She met his eyes. "It would mean some time in Billings, correspondence, possibly a trip to the county records there." She paused. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you." "I know you're not asking for permission," he said. "I know the difference." She looked at him. "Write her back," he said. "Tell her yes." She held his gaze for a long moment. "You understand that if I do this once and it works, there will be others." "I expect there will," he said. "This county has more Thomas Holloways than one," she said. "Probably every county does." "Probably," he said. "And I'm apparently the person who knows how to find the seams in what they build." "You are," he said. She looked at the letter in her hand. Then she looked at him. "I walked 22 miles to get to this ranch," she said. "I was looking for a place where the work was what mattered, where what I could do was worth more than what I didn't have." She paused. "I found that here. I found more than that here." She set the letter down on the table between them. "I don't think it was supposed to stop at our fence line." He looked at her across the table, his wife, his partner, the woman who had rebuilt his ranch and his heart and 3 of his neighbors' futures, who had walked into his life with bleeding feet and a cloth bag, and more competence and more courage than anyone he had ever known, and felt something in his chest that was not complicated at all. That was, in fact, the simplest thing he had felt in years. "Write her back," he said again. Clara picked up her pen, and in the December dark of the Montana Territory, in a warm kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, with thunder settled in his barn, and the herd quiet in the south pasture, and the Carter Ranch whole around them, she wrote the letter that was the beginning of the next thing, because that was who she was. She did not stop at the fence line. She never had. Years later, when people in Red Hollow told the story, and they did tell it around dinner tables, and in dry goods stores, and at the edges of church gatherings, the way small counties told the stories that had shaped them, they called it the story of the barefoot woman. The woman who had walked onto a dying ranch and never left. They said she had saved William Carter. They said she had saved the county. What those who knew them best understood was something quieter and more true. Clara Whitfield had not come to Red Hollow to save anyone. She had come to do honest work and be seen clearly and build something real in a world that had told her more than once that women like her didn't get to build. She had built anyway, and William Carter, who had spent 5 years proving he didn't need anyone, had loved her for exactly that. Not despite the stubbornness and the opinions and the counter-filings and the refusal to be managed. Because of it. Because she was exactly, completely, unapologetically herself, and she had walked 22 miles on bleeding feet to find a place that deserved her. She had found it. She had built the rest. Some people arrived in your life asking to be saved. Clara Whitfield arrived asking for a job, and she stayed because she decided to, and she changed everything, because she couldn't help it, because competence and honesty and the flat refusal to be less than you are had a way of doing that. That was the truth of it. The barefoot woman came to the ranch with nothing. She built everything that mattered, and she never left.